This is Test Case Scenario with me, your host, Jason Baum. This podcast is the definitive hub for knowledge and stories in the software testing and development communities. If you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button and let's dive straight into the episode. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Test Case Scenario. I'm your host, Jason Baum. With me as usual, Marcus Merrill, and we are joined by a special guest today, Rachael Yomtoob. Rachael, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. And Rachael comes to us from Deque Systems. Rachael is a product owner over there of the DevTools Mobile. And Rachael, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so I just celebrated my 5 years of working in digital accessibility for full time for 5 years. And so maybe I'll talk a little bit about my story of how I got into that. So I started off, I was studying computer science at the University of Michigan. And as many juniors in college, didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. But I ended up on a project team that was focused on building an Android application for indoor navigation of one of the buildings on campus, specifically for visually impaired people. So we were trying to solve the issue of visually impaired students or blind students or faculty. The first day of classes, you need to figure out where you need to go and into your classroom in the buildings. That was the problem that my team was set out to solve. And that kind of opened me to this whole world of like, oh, wow, I never thought about the fact that a blind person could use a mobile phone. I didn't know that TalkBack existed, which is the Android screen reader that allows blind people to access and essentially it reads out all of the content on their mobile device for them. And so that got me, super interested and passionate about this. Like, oh, wow, I can make a difference in the world using technology and grant access to the technology to more people. And through that team, I made connections with Deque. And then I ended up joining as an intern on our DevTools Mobile product team, where I started as a web developer, actually. So I had this kind of unique experience of getting to build a web dashboard to view the results of automated accessibility testing for mobile applications. So I got to learn about native mobile app accessibility at the same time as web accessibility, which I'm sure we can dig into why those two things are different and what all that means. But I got to learn about those both at the same time, which I think, gives me a really unique skill set. And from there, I progressed into the product owner role for DevTools Mobile. So I got to engage with a lot of our customers and learn about how large enterprises implement accessibility testing into their development cycles. And then through that feedback, improve our product and deliver the features that are going to help developers and dev teams fix accessibility issues and prevent accessibility issues. And then I took a step back and pivoted and started doing a developer advocacy role at Deque, which was kind of new and exciting and different for me. So I got to go out and speak at conferences and write blog posts and create YouTube videos and be on podcasts like this. But ultimately, I realized recently within the last month or so that my true heart is in product development. I like solving problems and I like the more technical detail side of it. But I do love the speaking aspect, the content creation, not so much. I'm the making my PowerPoint, up until the very last minute before I'm giving a talk kind of person.
Yeah, me too. Who isn't though?
Right. So the blog post writing and video content creation was a little bit hard for me to get in the right motivation and mindset to do. Whereas I love to just jump right in with our team and solve problems. So I was like, I can do both, right? I can in my day-to-day be with the product team solving product problems, and then have opportunities like this where I can record a podcast with y'all or go speak at a conference. I can still do both. So that's where I've landed at today.
Awesome. And we have scratched the surface of accessibility in software and accessibility in testing, but we haven't really done a deep dive. Neither Marcus nor I are really in it, so to speak. We're just speaking from our own opinions. So it's great to have someone who really, understands and is actually in it on the podcast to be able to talk through it a little more completely, because it deserves so much more attention than it currently gets. Marcus, what were those stats that you threw out on the last episode that we did on accessibility?
Yeah, so just a couple of things I always talk through when I'm advocating for accessibility, at least for our customers, people who make software. And the first one is that 15% of web users require assistive technology in order to sort of get their tasks done on a daily basis. Something like 60, 63, I don't remember the number exactly, are prevented from being able to do so because accessibility on a given platform is broken. It doesn't hasn't been implemented right. And so I always think that, if you're not doing it, you're either missing out on a brand new market that you could be capturing, or you're missing out on the market you're already in because you're not including everyone in your potential audience. So what I always think of is you can do it because it's the right thing to do, which doesn't seem to be enough motivation. You can do it because it'll generate revenue, which is sometimes enough motivation, or you can do it because you're afraid of getting sued, which usually in the end is the thing that gets the job done. I'm not happy about it, but it does seem to produce results. I'm curious how your career sort of matches with all those stats.
Yeah. I would say everything that you mentioned definitely resonates. Those kind of three stages of like three approaches of how you can talk to an enterprise or a leadership organization within an enterprise and, get them to care about accessibility. Those kind of three angles of, hey, let's do this. This is the right thing to do. Same thing. Maybe let's do this because we know that there's an untapped market that we can access. But I agree. Most of our clients come to us because either they already have been sued or they think they've now realized that they might be sued. My experience over the past 4 years of how when a company starts thinking about accessibility for the first time and what that scenario looks like, there's definitely a pattern to that. Fortunately, does include lawsuits a lot.
To that note, the last time we had talked about accessibility, gosh, it was several months ago. It might have been almost a year ago at this point. And we said that new laws were potentially going to be coming out because we talked about the ADA laws that are in place in the physical world, I guess, if you will. When I go to a building, it needs to have a ramp, right? If there's stairs, and it needs to, all the things that we already know in existence that don't necessarily have the same legal ramifications in the digital world. But I guess at the time we thought that was changing. Has that changed?
I would say it's ever evolving, right? So
okay.
There's some things in law that are like very hard and fast in the law. Like, so we have Section 508, which means any software product that the federal government procures needs to be accessible to, I don't remember which exact WCAG level, but it specifies a WCAG level that products need to adhere to. So there are definitely existing things in place that are like, maybe a day-to-day person would think of like, oh, this is the law that my website needs to be accessible. Like that doesn't exist, right? But I think that's just how legal things are once you actually start getting into the weeds of it. I will say some of the things that we can talk about in terms of where things are evolving. There's a lot of talk there's a new law in the EU called it's BAA, European Accessibility Act, I believe. And that has a deadline of 2025 for conformance. And that includes private and public sector companies. So that's kind of the big legal thing that's been on the horizon lately. Another thing is we can talk about WCAD, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And that's the guideline documentation that all of the laws end up pointing to, right? So these are the actual guidelines that developers and content authors are looking at to test against these guidelines. And so we just had in October, the latest version of WCAG was published, which is WCAG 2.2. And the way that WCAG works is there's the version, which is the 2.2, and that's cumulative. So we started with our baseline of WCAG 2.0. We added more criteria in 2.1, and then we added even more criteria now in 2.2. But we are largely moving towards WCAG 3, which is going to be a completely fundamentally different approach to the guidelines. So those are kind of like, I would say, maybe the things that have been hot in the legal side of accessibility in the last year or so.
Am I right in thinking that it's something like a year from the first week of June 2025, I believe, is when those regulations are going into effect in the EU? Is that your understanding?
Yeah, that is correct.
Yeah.
So we've been seeing a lot of blog posts and content from various accessibility people talking about it. Because you're correct. It's just about exactly a year from now.
You have a sense of what kind of, is it causing panic or fear or just regular, hey, we have to do this now? Is everyone sort of keeping calm? What are you seeing in the industry in terms of like the temperature, I guess?
The temperature. It's interesting. So I had my first chance to actually travel to Europe and attend some accessibility events last fall in November. It's interesting to see how, I don't know, there's just a different fundamental approach to it, if that makes sense. So the Europeans think they're behind because their law is only coming out now. But in other regards, like, I don't know if it's just more like the human perspective, they have more of the let's do it because it's the right thing to do attitude. And it's almost like now the legal stuff is like catching up to that to like kind of get those last wranglers that aren't on board, if that makes sense. One of the biggest things I noticed just traveling in Europe was the amount of just like physical things in the space that I could see representation of disability that I don't see here in the US.
That's interesting. Do you think you were seeing them because there were more disabled people, or do you think you were seeing them because they had the means to get around better in the world?
Yeah, I would say more so the latter. Another interesting thing was I turned on a TV in a hotel room in London, and there was a sign language person interpreting just right there on the screen natively. Like I didn't have to do anything to turn that on. And I was like, oh, wow. You never like see sign language interpretation on a national TV show in the US, you know?
I believe that. They're a culture that likes to queue, right? Like line up. They like lining up. I feel like they don't fight. In America, we can't do that. Like someone has to cut and push and shove and they get angry. So I totally believe that they're doing it for the right reasons. When I love this country, but we will never do it for the right reasons, unfortunately.
Yeah, I just got back from a 2-week trip with my father to Europe. He walks with a cane. He's walked with a cane my whole life. Everywhere we went, airport, train station, even on the bus, everyone moved out of his way. They let him cut straight to the front of the line, looked out for him and for anyone around us that had disability. And it was not derided. It wasn't commented upon. It was simply how they operate in a world that, you know, I think you're right, Jason. It's not that there are more people with disabilities. It is that this world is a safer and more accessible place for people. They're not cooped up at home because they don't have to be.
They have access.
So I was like, Dad, I want to move to Europe. I just wanted to see him have a better time of it, you know?
I was just going to kind of like wrap this around because there's a philosophy of the medical model of disability versus the social model of disability, which I think we've kind of really hit on the fact that maybe Europeans are more inclined to think about the social model of disability where it's society is the problem. We need to make society work in a way that is accessible for all of these variances in people that we have. Whereas the medical model of disability looks at it more as the person who has the disability has a problem, and it's not that. So a really good analogy I like to think about is if there was a world where everyone in that society was in a wheelchair, they would build everything to work for them. So like the ceilings would be a lot lower. Everything would be ramps. There would be no stairs. And then if you were a full 6 foot tall person and you came into that world, what would happen? You'd hit your head. And then would you be the problem or would the world be the problem, right?
Apply this to software where you have a keyboard and you have a screen and you have speakers. How do you make it to where we model the world to include people who have trouble? And not only those 3 elements, there are other kinds of disabilities that need to be accounted for, neurodivergence and stuff like that. So starting with the more physical ones that are, you know, intuitive around, you know, keyboard, screen, speakers. How do you see the difficulty or the ease these days of implementing software accessibility into people's work?
Yeah, I would say in my past 5 years of being in the deep end of digital accessibility, everything's getting easier to make accessible, right? So I've seen the release of like Swift UI and Jetpack Compose for iOS and Android are the new frameworks for building UIs on mobile applications. We can tell that Apple and Google took like an initiative to make components, like design those UI frameworks in a way that it's more difficult to make inaccessible experiences. So talking about the concept of accessibility by default, we're seeing more of these component libraries and things like that, where out of the box, if you use it as intended, it should be accessible. And so I've definitely seen, just an upward trajectory of things getting easier. We can also maybe talk about AI and how that plays in. I'm sure that's a buzzword maybe.
AI, we never talk about AI on a podcast.
Right?
What is this
no
AI?
one wants to hear about that. It's interesting because we can maybe tie this back to what I was talking about with the new versions of guidelines, right? I think Marcus mentioned thinking about disability from different angles and perspectives and different types of disability. Earlier forms of the guidelines did focus more on those input formats that Marcus was describing in terms of keyboard navigation and screen reader navigation and audio content and captions. And it didn't think as much about maybe cognitive disabilities or motor disabilities. So the more recent iterations, the 2.1 and 2.2, did take efforts to incorporate more of those criteria. One example for neurodivergent people or people with cognitive disabilities, there was a criteria added called consistent help. So if you have, like maybe a question mark help icon in your website, you want to keep that in the same exact place on every page. So maybe that's at the top in your navigation bar. It's always in the same place.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the development of the software, obviously we're a testing company at Sauce Labs, so we talk about the testing component of it. Why is accessibility testing crucial in the development process?
Yes. And this is another one where I wish I had the stats in my back pocket, but I don't. I think it might be like Deque has a report on essentially the return on investment for finding accessibility issues sooner in the development cycle. So it exponentially increases the later in the development cycle you find the issue, right? So if you ship your app to production and you didn't think about accessibility whatsoever, it never crossed your mind, you ship your application and then someone's like, oh, hey, have you heard about this accessibility thing? And then you go do an audit and then you have 1,000 issues. That's super overwhelming, costs a lot of money, costs a lot of time to go back and fix that. We call it the concept of shifting left. So shift accessibility testing further left into your development process. And that can be even as early as design. There's some types of issues that are critical to catch in design. I would talk about a great example on mobile would be screen orientation. Some companies will be like, no, our business case, we're only going to have our app in portrait mode. We don't need to support landscape mode. However, if someone is in a wheelchair and has a tablet mounted to their wheelchair, more cases than not, that tablet will be in a fixed orientation. So if your app only works in portrait mode and their device is in landscape mode, then they're going to have to, not be able to use your app because they can't, everything's sideways. And that's always a great example of something that if you don't account for that in design, it's a nightmare to even think about fixing that later.
Yeah, the colors for colorblind, making sure the colors are accessible. Yeah, I mean, there's so many applications that you have to think about.
I mean, the one that gets me all the time is font size. I am, I'm a bit of an older gentleman. I have to change the default font size on my phone, and it, for apps where they don't design any sort of a scroll bar or mechanism for moving the screen, if I make my font size a certain amount, then either text is going to get cut off or it's going to get replaced with ellipses in a way that I simply cannot view the content. I can't. It's flipping it. Landscape, portrait, doesn't matter. I'm shut out of getting fundamental knowledge from a lot of apps, frankly.
I myself find myself with the closed captioning on more often than, unfortunately, I'd like to admit these days. But it's I'm pretty sure it's from years of playing music and listening to a lot of music way too loud and going to lots of concerts. But I am definitely in the camp of starting to have hearing difficulties. And now that I'm experiencing it more and more in my life, online applications such as this or Zoom has great captioning. Some software has wonderful closed captioning, and most do not have any sort of closed captioning. And that was shocking to me when I first started to really use it more often.
Yeah. I kind of want to latch on to something you maybe inadvertently said, or you probably didn't even think was important, but
okay.
You
I love that.
Yeah. You were like, I use captions more than I care to admit, as if using captions is a shameful thing.
This is true. This is true.
That's a really interesting viewpoint, right? We need to do better as a society in terms of accepting people with disabilities or even, thinking about disability, that portion of it does not mean like a negative connotation, and it actually means different. So these tools that we traditionally think of as it's for someone who needs help or they have a problem and this fixes their problem. It's a lot more inclusive to think about it from the angle of like universal design.
I love that. And it's so funny that I said it. I actually have a podcast on the mental side of it. I've shared this in other worlds, but my father was a therapist. My grandfather was a therapist, so I'm in therapy now. And diving into removing stigma on mental health, because I grew up in a home where mental health and seeing a therapist and talking about your feelings and all those things, that was the norm, right? That was the usual. There was no stigma for me. And then went out in the real world and saw, people do not talk about this freely, and there is a lot of stigma. And so I actually have another podcast that I've started that's all about that and sharing very personal things in order to destigmatize. So it's interesting, though, how I did not, for myself, apply that same application for a physical thing, which is just interesting that you caught that. And now I'm going to spend a lot of time processing it.
Now you're going to go talk to your therapist about it.
I'm going to talk to my therapist. Why do I have this thing about my, well, I thought about my hair too. And then I realized how quick I can get ready in the morning and I have no more stigma with being bald.
Turn it into a strength, man.
Yeah. It is. I should have done it years ago is what I said.
Yeah. Outside of the fact that I think that everyone needs to learn to build more empathy and not wait until their own eyesight goes bad in order to change the font size.
That's right.
How do you find teams most successfully adopting accessibility practices in both development and testing?
Yeah, I would say maybe the key there was both development and testing, right? You're never going to be able to, or maybe never's, we have AI, you can do whatever, never's a bit of an absolute. It's magic. But one of the things I always like to talk about is you're not going to catch every single issue with automation. So there is still a lot of benefit in manual testing as well. Obviously, we want to work to automating more and more and more as we go. But what's important is when they're able to get buy-in from the varying parts of the development teams. So when you get buy-in from design and development and testing, that's when you're able to really succeed, because then you're able to have everyone thinking about it, so that it's kind of like a Swiss cheese model, if you've ever heard of that, where at every level of the development cycle, you're putting in a slice of Swiss cheese to catch your accessibility issues. So, maybe some will come through in design, but maybe the Swiss cheese layer at development testing will catch that. And the more layers, more pieces of cheese that you stack together, the less accessibility issues make it out to production. I'm just kind of playing with that analogy now. Actually, I've heard it before in the case of aviation, but I was like, "Ooh, maybe that fits here."
I wouldn't have no idea that you just thought of that on the fly had you not just disclosed it. So,
do you find that product also has a place in the conversation? I've heard engineering and testing and developers and design. I would think that product should also be in there. I mean, ideally, product is driving it, but I don't know if that's realistic. In the real world. One thing I would say is just like when you see someone in the world being, assisted or using assistive technology or taking advantage of these tools, to me, there's a dopamine hit that someone in the world created a situation that would enable a whole population of people to get to something that they couldn't get to otherwise. And us having done a little bit of work on that, here at Sauce, talking to our customers about how we work with Deque in partnership to help that kind of thing. You just there's such a good feeling you get your own ally cookies right there, just from your own brain, by helping people make things more accessible. And I'm like, no, for no other reason, man. This is such a powerful feeling to have, to really help people and see it make a difference in being more inclusive.
I get that same dopamine hit that you described too. And I'm also the same person who's like, when I see any sort of accessibility feature or button in the wild, I press it. So for example, most recently, have you seen the elevators that have a tablet with the numbers for the floor, and you press the number and then the elevator arrives and then you get in and it takes you to the floor, so you don't use the keypad inside the elevator?
Yeah, our building has that. Yeah.
Uh-huh. I saw one of those in the wild, and it had an icon of someone in a wheelchair. So I was like, accessibility. I was like, how is someone who is blind going to use this? Touchscreen. And so I press the button, and then you hear it go 1, 2, 3, and it's like reading out every floor. And then I think it instructed you to tap anywhere on the screen when you heard the floor, or maybe it was press that same button again, something like that. But what really stuck out to me was okay, this is taking forever. It's 1, And then I was like, did the person that designed this ever listen to someone using a screen reader on a phone or on their computer? Like anyone who is a full-time screen reader user has the speed up like super duper fast. They want those floors to be read out in like 1 second and they can press the button and go. So yeah, I'm definitely always interested in how things are thought through or not.
Also, how do they press the button?
Yeah,
how do they find that specific button?
Yeah. How do they know that they need to go to that thing and press the button, right?
Without touching every other button for every floor. Yeah. I would wonder that too. That's really interesting. You have to think about these things intentionally, right? And something you said, Marcus, the word, and I kept coming back to that word and was kind of hoping to end it with this word, but you used it. It is a kind of group empathy, right? We have to get to this point where as a society, we are more empathetic. And yet, I think that's unfortunately a tough thing to get to as a society at whole. That, I mean, we are still a people that have war. You know, like there's so many things that need help, unfortunately. And empathy is just something that is not all that common, unfortunately. Not to be pessimistic, but it's just, I think, a reality, unfortunately, that we're dealt. And so then it is an intentional thing, right? Of having to think about others and prioritizing other people's needs in addition to the ones that we take for granted. Rachel, what advice do you have to organizations who are looking to prioritize, who are making that intentional decision to prioritize accessibility initiatives?
I think that resonates with another question that I get a lot. So I think maybe you're asking from the organization perspective. Maybe some people that are higher up have made the decision and they want to invest in accessibility for their products. But we also get the question asked a lot from designers or the developers that are like, how do I get my leadership to care about it? I think it's a combination of both, right? We need to have a combination of a top-down and a bottom-up approach. And it just, is going to vary based on your organization and maturity. We talk about accessibility maturity, which I think is also probably tied to just development process maturity as well. And so it's going to vary. And so maybe kind of pivoting back to one thing that Marcus had mentioned is like kind of who are the players in terms of roles within an organization for accessibility. One thing that I didn't touch on yet is we often see the concept of a central accessibility team, where there's a specific team that is dedicated or responsible for ensuring that the company's products are accessible. And within that model, that can work well because you have a team of experts who are specialized and they really understand accessibility and they can work with individual teams and spread that knowledge. And oftentimes those are the purchasers of our tools. So we have this central team then working with other development teams to implement our testing tools into their cycles. So that's one model from kind of the kind of top-down approach. But the more bottom-up approach would just be, just start using free accessibility testing tools in your process yourself and just start talking about it with your developers that work with you in the day-to-day and be like, hey, I ran an accessibility scan on this and I found this issue and it's really easy to fix. So I'm just going to fix it, And over time, more and more people start talking about that and more people realize, oh, it's actually not that big of a deal to think about accessibility in our development cycle. And so it really varies. We see a lot of different mixes and matches and combinations of those approaches. And it's really interesting to see how organizations can really mature their accessibility processes and travel throughout their journey. That's one of the cool things about working at Deque, I think, is we want to help our clients along that accessibility journey. So I've gotten to see some of these clients really grow and have really mature, stabilized accessibility programs now.
Yeah,
amazing.
Well, this is why we love having Deque as a really strong partner in the testing ecosystem. We're really grateful for your partnership.
Yeah, absolutely. Rachel, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Really appreciate your insights and the partnership with Deque. And where are the best places that people can find more information?
Pluggables. What are your pluggables?
My pluggables. You can find me on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it. I call it Twitter. I'm Yomtoob, RYOMTOOB on there. I'm also on LinkedIn. You can connect with me. Otherwise, you can hit up deque.com for all of the Deque accessibility offerings that we have to support you in your journeys, and specifically DevTools Mobile. That's my baby. So
can you spell Deque for everyone?
Yes, DEQUE.
Thank you so much again for coming on. We have to do this again, I think.
Yeah,
I think
I'd love to
we
come
should
back.
have as many accessibility episodes as we can.
Awesome. Thank you
Awesome.
for having me.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for listening today. As we always say, we really appreciate the time that you have given us to listen in. Time is our greatest. Is it an asset? Is it, I don't know what time is. Time's amazing and it's fleeting. And so therefore any bit that you could give to us, we really appreciate. And we will see you next time on Test Case Scenario. Thank you for joining us on Test Case Scenario. Share your thoughts in the comments. We'll make sure to respond to each and every single one. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to keep in touch. If you missed our last episode, it's popping up on your screen right now. Go, click it. Until next time on Test Case Scenario.